In a stifling Haraston courtroom, Nia Jackson sat rigid as Judge Hargrove's gavel crashed, declaring her guilty of evidence tampering, her fate sealed in a blur of racist lies. Sweat trickled down her neck when a DOJ agent bolted through the doors, yelling she was their undercover lead investigator. The room erupted in stunned gasps, but Officer Trent Baxter's cold smirk lingered, whispering a sinister truth. This split-second twist shattered Nia's world, igniting a firestorm of vengeance that would scar her future. What had she uncovered to spark such ruthless retaliation? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against corruption, hit that like button and subscribe for more jaw-dropping tales. Nia Jackson adjusted her sunglasses as she rolled into Haraston, Georgia, the late summer sun baking the cracked asphalt of this sleepy southern city, her sleek black sedan cutting through the humid haze like a blade through butter, her mind already spinning with the mission ahead, a covert operation she'd trained for over a decade to execute with surgical precision. Her badge tucked away, her identity cloaked in shadow, because the Department of Justice didn't send her here to play nice. They sent her to root out rot. Festering deep in the Haraston Police Department, a cesspool of whispers about missing case files and crooked cops she'd been tracking from her DC desk for months, her sharp hazel eyes missing nothing as she pulled into a dusty parking lot near the precinct, her cover as a freelance auditor airtight, her files stuffed with dummy reports to sell the lie. But her real target was the underbelly of this force, the kind of corruption that didn't just bend the law, it snapped it in half and laughed while doing it, and she knew stepping into this lion's den meant painting a target on her back, especially as a black woman in a town where the Confederate flag still fluttered on too many porches, her skin a silent challenge to the good old boys who ran this place. But Nia didn't flinch. She thrived on the edge. Her years as a lawyer turned investigator, honing her into a weapon of intellect and grit, her every move calculated, her every word a chess play, because she'd seen the stats, the missing evidence logs, the dismissed brutality cases, and she'd heard the rumors of a drug ring shielded by badges. And now she was here to peel back the layers, to expose the truth no matter how ugly it got. Her rented apartment, a sparse base camp where she spread out her notes each night, her laptop glowing with encrypted DOJ intel, her fingers flying across, keys as she cross-referenced arrest records, her focus unbreakable even as the cicadas screamed outside her window, their drone a fitting soundtrack to the unease creeping up her spine. Because she wasn't naive, she knew eyes were on her from day one, whispers trailing her through the precinct halls where officers smirked behind coffee mugs, their glances lingering too long, their muttered slurs brushing past her like flies she swatted away. But she pressed on, her audits a front to slip into restricted servers, her late-night searches uncovering gaps, cases closed too fast, evidence vanished into thin air, her gut telling her someone big was pulling strings, someone with power and no conscience. And then she met Officer Trent Baxter, a hulking figure with a buzz cut and a sneer, his broad chest straining against his navy uniform as he loomed over her desk one muggy afternoon, his pale blue eyes glinting with something feral as he tossed a stack of papers at her, barking that she'd better stay in her lane if she knew what was good for her, his voice thick with a drawl that carried both threat and disdain, his badge a shield he wore like armor. But Nia didn't blink. She leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a faint smile as she asked if he had anything to hide, her tone cool as ice, her defiance a spark that lit something dark in his gaze, because Trent wasn't just any cop. He was the kind who thrived on control, the kind who'd risen through the ranks on intimidation and backroom deals, his record spotless on paper, but reeking of dirt to anyone who knew where to look. And Nia knew she'd seen his name pop up too often in those missing files, his signature, on botched reports, his unit tied to raids that ended with suspects dead and evidence gone. So she dug deeper, her nights stretching into dawn as she traced his movements, her covert cameras catching him slipping cash to informants in back alleys, her audio bugs picking up his growled orders to clean up messes she couldn't yet pin down, her evidence piling up, a ticking bomb she kept locked in a safe beneath her floorboards, because she wasn't ready to blow this wide open. Not yet. She needed more. Needed airtight proof to take down a man like Trent, but he wasn't waiting for her to finish. He was watching her too, his suspicion festering into something uglier, something personal, because to him, she wasn't just a threat, she was an insult. A black woman daring to challenge his kingdom, and he wasn't about to let that stand. So one sticky evening as Naya walked to her car, her keys jangling in her hand, her senses sharp from years of fieldwork, she didn't see the trap until it sprang. Trent and two of his lackeys stepping from the shadows, their boots crunching gravel as they boxed her in. His smirk wide and vicious as he held up a baggie of cocaine, dangling it like a trophy before tossing it through her open car window. His voice low and mocking as he said she'd regret sticking her nose where it didn't belong, his slur hitting her like a slap. "You think you're slick, thug. We'll see how you like the cage." And before she could react, he slammed her against the hood, his meaty hands pinning her arms as his pals cuffed her, their laughter echoing in the empty lot, her heart pounding not from fear, but from fury. As he activated his body cam, narrating his lie for the world to hear, caught this troublemaker with the goods resisting arrest, his words a script he'd rehearsed, her protests drowned out by his bellows as he shoved her into the squad. Car, her wrists aching from the steel biting into her skin, her mind racing as headlights flared and neighbors peeked from curtains, their faces a mix of shock and judgment, because Trent didn't just want her gone, he wanted her ruined, wanted the whole town to see her as the criminal he'd painted her to be, his frame up a masterstroke of malice that turned her mission into a nightmare, her DOJ cover still intact but teetering, because she couldn't call for backup, not yet, not without blowing her whole op. So she sat in that car, her jaw tight, her eyes burning into the back of Trent's head as he drove, his smug chuckles filling the air, his plan unfolding with brutal efficiency, because he'd timed it perfectly, the precinct buzzing as he paraded her in, his fellow officers clapping him on the back like he'd bagged a prize buck, her booking a circus of jeers and paperwork. Her mugshot snapped under flickering lights, her fingerprints smudged onto a card she knew would haunt her. And all the while she held her tongue, her silence a shield as she plotted her next move, because Trent thought he'd won, thought he'd crushed her. But he didn't know who he was dealing with, didn't know the fire he'd lit in her gut, the kind that didn't flicker out under pressure but blazed hotter, because Nia wasn't just some auditor, she was a hunter, and he'd just made himself her prey, his frame up a bold opening salvo in a war he couldn't imagine, because she'd been building her case for weeks. Her evidence stashed safe, her resolve steel, and though he'd landed this blow, she wasn't down, not by a long shot. Her mind, already spinning through contingencies as they locked her in a holding cell, the clang of the bars a taunt she ignored, her gaze fixed on the peeling paint of the wall because she knew this was just the beginning, knew Trent's ego would drive him to push harder, to dig his own grave, and she'd be there to bury him. In it, her mission compromised but not dead, her cover a threadbare veil now stretched to breaking, because Trent wasn't content to stop here. He'd escalate, he'd gloat, he'd overplay his hand, and when he did, she'd be ready. Her pulse steady, even as the cell's chill seeped into her bones. Her thoughts a storm of strategy and vengeance, because this wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every soul this town had chewed up and spat out under Trent's reign. Every case he'd buried, every life he'd crushed, and she'd make him pay for it all one way or another. Because Nia Jackson didn't break, she bent the world to her will, and Trent Baxter was about to learn that the hard way, his laughter, still ringing in her ears as the night stretched on, the clock ticking down to a reckoning neither of them could foresee, a collision of wills that would shake Haraston to its core, because she'd come here to expose the truth, and nothing, not cuffs, not lies, not even Trent's twisted game, would stop her from dragging it into the light. Nia Jackson sat at the defense table, her spine straight as a rod despite the suffocating heat of the Haraston courtroom, her dark blazer clinging to her skin as ceiling fans whirred uselessly overhead, her hazel eyes scanning the space with the precision of a hawk, every detail a potential weapon in the fight she knew was rigged from the jump, because this wasn't justice. This was a lynching dressed up in legal robes, the air thick with the musk of old wood and older prejudice as the trial kicked off, her wrists still raw from Trent Baxter's cuffs 2 weeks prior, her mind replaying that night in the parking lot when he'd planted the cocaine. his slur still burning in her ears. Thug, a word he'd spat like venom. And now here she was, facing the music he'd orchestrated, the gallery packed with townsfolk whispering behind their hands, their stares a mix of curiosity and contempt, because to them she was already guilty. A black woman who dared to step out of line, her lawyer Marcus Tate beside her, his wiry frame hunched over notes, his brown eyes flicking nervously to the jury box where 12 pale faces sat stiffly, their expressions carved from stone. Not a single one reflecting her, not a single one likely to see past the color of her skin. And across the room, Officer Trent Baxter lounged at the prosecutor's table, his navy uniform crisp, his broad shoulders squared like he owned the place, his buzz cut gleaming under the fluorescent lights as he shot her a smirk, a predator sizing up prey he'd already wounded because he knew the deck was stacked, knew this town bent to his will. And as the bailiff called the room to order, Judge Hargrove swept in, his silver hair slicked back, his stern face etched with lines that spoke of decades upholding a system Nia had spent her career dismantling, his gavel cracking down like a gunshot, silencing the murmurs as he barked, "This court is now in session," his voice a gravelly drawl that carried the weight of finality, and Nia braced herself, her pulse steady, her resolve iron, because she'd faced worse. But this felt different, this felt personal. The prosecutor rising first, a lanky man named Gerald Vance with a hawkish nose and a rehearsed swagger, his suit grey and ill-fitting as he launched into his opening. "Ladies and gentlemen, Nia." Jackson tampered with evidence under the guise of an audit, obstructing justice to protect her own kind, his words dripping with accusation, his finger jabbing toward her as if she were a stain on the room, and she felt the jury's eyes bore into her, their doubt a palpable force, because her own kind wasn't subtle. It was a dog whistle loud enough to wake the dead, and Trent took the stand next, his boots thudding against the tiles, his oath a mockery as he swore to tell the truth, his pale blue gaze locking onto hers with a glint of triumph as he spun his tale. "She stole evidence to shield criminals, interfered with my busts, cost us cases." His voice smooth as oil, his lies piling up like bricks in a wall she couldn't climb, and Nia clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into woe. Her palms, because every word was a fabrication, a twisted script he'd rehearsed to bury her, his unit's missing files her target. Not her crime, but who'd believe her here, in a room where justice wore a white hood and Marcus shot too, his feet, his voice sharp as he cross-examined. "Officer Baxter, your logs show gaps, evidence vanishing on your watch, care to explain that?" His tone slicing through the smug haze Trent exuded, and for a moment Nia saw a crack, Trent's jaw tightening, his fingers twitching as he muttered, "Records get messy in the field," a flimsy dodge Marcus pounced on. "Messy enough to lose whole cases or just the ones you didn't want solved," and the jury shifted, a few brows furrowing, a flicker of doubt she latched onto because this was her shot, her chance to turn the tide. And Marcus kept pushing, pulling up reports, timestamps, inconsistencies Trent couldn't smooth over, his questions relentless. "Why'd your unit log evidence out then back in Altered? Who authorized?" That he and Trent squirmed, his smirk fading as Marcus laid bare the sloppy trail. The room buzzing with tension, Nia's chest swelling with hope, because she thought she was winning, thought the truth might actually break through. But then the gallery stirred, a ripple of movement as Trent's buddies filed in, 5 officers. In uniform, their bulk filling the back rows, their eyes hard and unyielding as they stared down the witnesses Marcus had lined up. A mechanic who'd seen Trent near her car, a clerk who'd logged his late-night visits to the evidence room, and one by one those witnesses faltered, their voices dropping to mumbles, their stories shifting under the weight of those glares. "I don't recall," the mechanic stammered. "Maybe I got the dates wrong," the clerk backtracked, and Nia's stomach sank, her hope curdling into dread, because this wasn't just a trial, it was a power play. Trent's crew, a silent army, choking the truth before it could breathe. And Gerald Vance leaned into it, piling on doctored emails, forged logs, painting her as a rogue who'd betrayed the badge she didn't even wear publicly, his narrative airtight to a jury primed to believe the worst. And as the day dragged on, the air grew heavier, the jurors' faces hardening, their nods sinking with Trent's tale because Marcus had fought like a lion, had landed blows, had cracked the facade, but it wasn't enough, not here. Not against a system that saw her as the enemy before she'd even opened her mouth. And Judge Hargrove watched it all, his stern gaze flickering between her and Trent. His silence a judgment in itself, because Nia knew he'd seen the holes, knew he'd caught the lies, but would he care, could he care? In a town where men like Trent held the reins, and as the prosecution rested, Gerald's final words rang. Out. She's a threat to law and order, a disgrace who hid behind her position. His voice a hammer driving nails into her coffin, and Marcus whispered to her, "We've got a shot, they're slipping." But she saw the jury's tight lips, their crossed arms, and she knew better, knew the tide had turned, because Trent's smirk was back, wider now, his victory a foregone conclusion as the judge called a recess, the gavel's echo a death knell, and Nia sat there, her mind racing, her body still, because she'd thought she could outsmart them, thought her evidence, her skill, her fight would matter. But this wasn't about proof. This was about power, about a black woman who dared to challenge the king of this crooked castle, and Trent's buddies in the gallery were the muscle enforcing his rule, their presence a noose tightening around her neck. And as the room emptied, she caught Trent's eye, his wink a promise of worse to come, because he wasn't just winning, he was savoring it. And she wondered how deep his reach went, how many more traps he'd set, because this courtroom wasn't the end, it was the beginning, a stage for a war she hadn't fully grasped, her mission teetering on the edge of collapse, her freedom hanging by a thread, and all she could do was wait. Wait for the verdict she knew was coming. Wait for the moment when the mask slipped, because she wasn't done. Not yet. Not even close. Her fire still burning. Her next move already. Forming because Trent thought he'd caged her. But cages could be broken, and she'd shatter this one no matter what it took. What do you think? Should a jury ever trust a cop like Trent over a woman like Nia? Comment number 1 if you say no way. Number 2 if you think she's already lost this fight, like if you're raging at this injustice, and subscribe to see her claw her way out of this mess. So what happens when the gavel falls? Does Nia crumble, or does someone crash the party to flip this twisted game upside down? Nia Jackson sat motionless at the defense table, her hands clasped tight, her breath shallow as the Haraston courtroom pulsed with the weight of impending doom. The jury filing back in after hours of deliberation, their faces a gallery of grim resolve. Each step a drumbeat in the silence that smothered the room, her lawyer Marcus Tate beside her, his fingers tapping nervously on his legal pad. His whispered, "We did our best," a hollow comfort as Judge Hargrove settled into his perch, his silver hair catching the dim light, his stern eyes sweeping the crowd before landing on her, his gavel poised like an executioner's axe. And she knew what was coming, felt it in the jury's averted gazes, in the way Trent Baxter leaned back at the prosecutor's table, his navy uniform pristine, his smirk a jagged slash across his face, because he'd won. His lies about her tampering with evidence, his frame-up with the cocaine, his goons silencing witnesses, all of it had stuck. And as the foreman rose, a wiry man with a pinched mouth, Nia braced herself, her heart thudding against her ribs, her mind flashing to her daughter Aisha, safe with her sister in Atlanta. A small mercy in this storm. And the foreman's voice cut through, "We find the defendant, Nia Jackson, guilty of evidence tampering and obstruction of justice." The words a sledgehammer to her chest, the gallery erupting in murmurs, some triumphant, some shocked, and Trent's eyes glinted with victory, his broad shoulders shaking with a silent laugh as Judge Hargrove nodded, his gavel crashing down, "So ordered, sentencing to follow," the sound a thunderclap sealing her fate, and Nia's world tilted, her mission to expose Haraston's corruption crumbling under the weight of this racist farce, her years with the DOJ reduced to a conviction she didn't earn. But before the bailiff could move, before the cuffs could snap back on her wrists, the courtroom doors burst open, wood slamming against plaster as a woman stormed in. Her dark suit crisp, her strides purposeful, her voice slicing through the chaos. "Stop this now, Nia Jackson is our lead investigator." And the room froze, every head swiveling to Agent Carla Ruiz, her DOJ badge flashing under the lights, her brown eyes blazing as she held up a thick dossier, Her words a lifeline Nia grabbed with both hands. She's been undercover for months, exposing corruption in this precinct. Trent Baxter's the real criminal here. And the gallery. Gasped. Her collective inhale that sucked the air dry, Judge Hargrove's gavel hovering mid-strike, his brow furrowing as Carla marched to the bench, slapping the dossier down. Read it. Fabricated evidence, drug rings, witness intimidation, all under Baxter's command, and Nia's pulse raced, her despair flipping to a flicker of hope. Because this was her out, her truth breaking free, and Marcus leapt up. Your Honor, this changes everything. His voice steady now, his nerves burned away by the fire of this twist. And Gerald Vance? The prosecutor shot to his feet, his hawkish face red. This is outrageous, she's a convict. But Carla cut him off. Check the logs, the recordings, it's all there. And the judge's eyes narrowed, his fingers flipping through pages, his silence stretching as the crowd held its breath. And Nia watched Trent, saw his smirk falter, his hands clenching the table's edge because he hadn't seen this coming, hadn't counted on the DOJ crashing his party, and Hargrove finally spoke. Charges are dismissed, effective immediately, his tone clipped, his gavel dropping softer this time. And the room exploded, reporters scribbling, spectators shouting, and Nia stood, her legs trembling, but her chin high, her victory a sharp blade cutting through. The lies because she was free, vindicated, her mission intact. And as the chaos swirled, she caught Trent's glare, his pale blue eyes burning with something darker now, something lethal. And he didn't wait long to strike back, because as she stepped outside, the humid dusk wrapping around her, he cornered her near the courthouse steps, his bulk blocking her path, his voice a low growl. This ain't over. Girl, you think you're untouchable now. His breath hot with whiskey and rage, his finger jabbing her chest, and she didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction, her reply cool. You're the one who's done. But his smirk returned, twisted and cold. We'll see about that. And he vanished into the crowd, leaving her with a chill that wasn't from the night air, because she knew he meant it, knew he wouldn't let this slide. And she was right, because hours later, as she unlocked her apartment door, her safe house now compromised, she stepped into a nightmare. The place trashed, furniture overturned, glass crunching under her boots, and across the living room wall in dripping red spray paint. The words screamed, "Go back where you came from, not we." Or? The slur a punch to her gut, her breath catching as she scanned the wreckage, her laptop. Gone, her notes shredded, and then she saw it, a photo of Aisha pinned to the wall. A kitchen knife stabbed through her smiling face, the blade buried deep in the plaster. And Nia's knees buckled, her hand flying to her mouth, because this wasn't just vandalism, this was a promise. Trent's revenge kicking off with a brutality she hadn't anticipated. Her victory in court, a hollow shell now, because he'd hit her where it hurt most, her daughter, her heart. And she stumbled to the phone, dialing Carla, her voice shaking as she reported it. He's coming for me, for Aisha. And Carla's response was instant. Get out, we're moving you now. But Nia couldn't move, not yet. Her eyes locked on that photo, the knife's glint a taunt. Because Trent wasn't playing defense anymore. He was on the attack, his power in Harasses deeper than she'd guessed, his network ready to escalate. And as she grabbed her go-bag, her mind raced, piecing it together. Because the ransacking wasn't random, he'd taken her laptop, her backups. He knew what she had, knew she could bury him, and this was his counterstrike, a declaration of war. Because he wasn't just a crooked cop. He was a kingpin, and she'd threatened his throne, and now he'd make her pay. Make her bleed. And as she fled into the night, the humid air thick with menace, she heard sirens in the distance. Too late. To matter, because Trent's message was clear. He'd lost the battle, but not the fight, and he'd come for her family, her life, everything she held dear, and Nia's triumph twisted into terror. Her DOJ shield flimsy against this kind of hate, because she'd underestimated him. Thought the law would hold, but this was Harasses, his turf, his rules. And as she sped away, her headlights cutting through the dark, she wondered how far he'd go, how much he'd take, because the photo wasn't a threat. It was a vow, and she knew he'd keep it, knew he'd strike again, harder, crueler, because men like Trent didn't bow out. They burned everything down, and she'd just lit the match. Her freedom a fleeting gasp before the storm, because Carla's voice echoed in her head. He's mobilizing. And Nia gripped the wheel, her jaw tight because she'd won in court. But the real fight was just beginning. A war she'd have to wage alone, because Trent Baxter wasn't done, not by a long shot. His smirk haunting her as she drove, his promise a shadow she couldn't outrun, because this was personal now, a vendetta carved in red paint and steel, and she'd have to be smarter, tougher, fiercer to survive what came next, because he'd hit her home, her soul, and he'd keep coming until one of them was dust. Nia Jackson gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she sped through Harriston's backroads, the humid night air seeping through the cracked window of her sedan, her pulse hammering in her ears as the image of Aisha's photo stabbed. Through with the kitchen knife seared her mind. The red spray paint on her apartment walls a neon scar she couldn't unsee. Her safe house now a war zone thanks to Trent Baxter's vengeance. His parting words on the courthouse steps, "This ain't over, girl." A prophecy unfolding faster than she'd feared, because she'd barely caught her breath from the DOJ's courtroom rescue, Agent Carla Ruiz's dossier flipping her guilty verdict into freedom, when Trent struck back, his break-in a gut punch that turned her triumph into ash. And now she was running, her go-bag slung across the passenger seat, her phone buzzing with Carla's terse orders. "Head to the safe house on Pine Street. We're locking this down." But Nia knew Harriston wasn't done with her yet. Knew Trent's reach stretched beyond his badge. And as dawn broke, the city erupted, the news hitting like a Molotov cocktail. Local station WHTV blaring headlines across every screen. DOJ investigator cleared, but was it a hoax? The anchor's voice oily with skepticism, her blonde hair stiff as she spun a tale Nia barely recognized. Nia Jackson, accused of evidence tampering, claims undercover status, but locals call her a race-baiting fraud. And Nia's stomach twisted, her vindication warped into a lie before she could blink, because Trent wasn't just fighting her in the shadows, he was poisoning the town against her. And by noon, the backlash hit fever pitch. Her new safe house on Pine Street, a flimsy sanctuary as pickup trucks roared past, Confederate flags flapping from tailgates, white supremacists spilling onto her lawn, their voices a guttural roar. "Get out, you don't belong here." Their fists clutching bricks they hurled through her windows, glass shattering inward, as Nia yanked Aisha behind the couch, her daughter's wide eyes brimming with terror. "Mummy, why do they hate us?" And Nia's throat tightened, her arms wrapping around her 8-year-old. "They're scared of the truth, baby." Her voice steady, even as her heart cracked, because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every black soul this town had crushed, and she shielded Aisha, her body a barricade as stones thudded against the walls. The mob's chants a venomous hymn. "Justice for Trent, lock her up." Their rage a tidal wave she couldn't outrun, because the news had flipped the script, WHTV airing interviews. With Trent's neighbors, "He's a hero, she's stirring trouble." Their words a match to the dry tinder of Harriston's bigotry, and Nia knew she had to fight back, had to reclaim the narrative. So she grabbed her burner phone, her fingers trembling as she uploaded a video to a secure platform, her face lit by the screen's glow. "I'm Nia Jackson, DOJ investigator. Trent Baxter framed me. Runs drugs, buries evidence, here's the proof." Her voice cutting through the night as she attached snippets of her recordings. Trent's growled orders to clean up cases, his cash handoffs in grainy alley footage, and she hit send. The post rippling online, likes ticking up as strangers shared it, comments flooding in. "Expose him. Stay strong." And for a moment she breathed, thinking she'd turned the tide because support swelled. A petition for Trent's arrest gaining traction, her allies in Atlanta texting, "We've got your back." And she dared to hope, dared to think the truth might win. But Trent wasn't. Sleeping, wasn't cowering, because hours later, as dusk painted the sky orange, WHTV aired a new bombshell, a grainy video of Nia assaulting Trent, his uniform torn, his face bruised as he stumbled back, his voice cracking, "She attacked me unprovoked." And Nia's jaw dropped, her safe house TV flickering with the lie, because it was fake, doctored, her hands nowhere near him, but the footage was slick, seamless, his bloodied lip a prop. She hadn't seen coming, and the mob outside roared louder. "Liar, thug!" Their numbers doubling as pickup trucks screeched to a halt, boots pounding the dirt, and she realized Trent had played her, had twisted her counterstrike into his weapon. Because the petition stalled, her online support fractured. Is this real? She's violent. The comments turning venomous, and then the air thickened with smoke, a brick crashing through the window, trailing a rag soaked in gasoline, flames licking up the curtains as Aisha screamed, "Mommy!" and Nia scooped her up, her lungs burning as she bolted for the back door. The mob's cheers a deafening wall. "Burn her out!" Their silhouettes dancing in the firelight, and she stumbled into the yard, her sedan parked 50 feet away, her only lifeline as the safe house blazed, her evidence, her clothes, her last shred of safety swallowed by the inferno. And she ran, Aisha's small hand clutching hers. Her daughter's sobs a dagger in her chest as they reached the car, tires squealing as she floored it, the rear windshield shattering under a final brick. The mob's faces a blur of hate in her mirror, and she drove, her breath ragged, her mind spinning because Trent's fake video had lit this fuse, had turned her victory into a riot, had burned her world to the ground, and as she hit the highway, the flames fading behind her, she called Carla. "He's winning, they torched it," her voice breaking, and Carla's reply was grim. "He's got help, we're digging." But Nia knew it wasn't enough. Knew Trent's power was a hydra. Each head she cut sprouting 2 more, because this wasn't just a mob. It was his army, fueled by lies she couldn't outshout, and Aisha whimpered beside her. "Where do we go?" And Nia's grip tightened. "Somewhere safe." A promise she wasn't sure she could keep because Trent had taken her home, her peace, her daughter's innocence, and he'd keep coming, his smirk a ghost in her mind. Because he'd lost in court but won the streets, his retaliation a fire she couldn't douse, and as the miles stretched on, the night swallowing them whole, she wondered how much more she could lose, how much more he'd take, because this was war now, raw and unrelenting, and she'd have to fight harder, smarter, fiercer to survive it, because Trent Baxter wasn't just a cop. He was a plague, and she was his target, her victory a spark he'd turned into a blaze, and she'd have to rise from these ashes or they'd bury her in them. Think Nia's got the guts to outlast this hate. Comment number 1 if you're rooting for her to crush Trent. Number 2 if you think he's already broken her, like if this mob's rage has you boiling, and subscribe to see if she turns the tables on this monster. So what's Trent's next move? Does he slink away, or does he pull a dagger from inside her own ranks to stab deeper? Nia Jackson clutched the steering wheel, her sedan humming along a deserted Georgia highway, the night a black shroud pierced only by her headlights, her daughter Aisha curled in the passenger seat, her small frame shivering under a borrowed jacket, her whimpers fading into shallow breaths as exhaustion claimed her, the glow of Harriston's burning safe house still a phantom in Nia's rearview, the mob's chants, "Burn her out," echoing in her skull, Trent Baxter's fake video of her assaulting him, the match that lit that inferno, his racist revenge a wildfire she couldn't outrun, her lungs still raw from smoke as she dialed Agent Carla Ruiz, her DOJ lifeline. "We're clear, heading to the new spot." Her voice hoarse, and Carla's reply crackled through, "Good. 2 miles east, Old Mill on Cutter Road, teams waiting." A promise of safety Nia clung to, because she needed walls, needed allies, needed a second to breathe after Trent's latest blow, and as she pulled into the mill's shadowed lot, gravel crunching under her tires, she spotted Carla's silhouette, her dark suit stark against the rusted steel of the abandoned building, her brown eyes sharp as she waved Nia in. "You're safe now." Her tone steady, and Nia exhaled, her shoulders slumping as she carried Aisha inside, the mill's dank air heavy with mildew, its cracked concrete floor a cold bed where she set her daughter down. Carla's team bustling around her, 4 agents in tactical gear, their faces grim but focused, laptops open, radios buzzing, and Nia sank against a wall, her knees drawn up, her mind racing to regroup, because Trent had torched her safe house, had turned Harriston against her. But she wasn't done, not yet. Her evidence still alive in her head, his drug ring her target, and she briefed Carla. "He's running coke through the precinct, I've got names, drop points." Her words clipped as she pulled a USB from her pocket, her last backup. "Caught him on tape, we can nail him." And Carla nodded, her jaw tight. "We'll set a sting, hit his warehouse tonight." Her plan snapping into place, and Nia felt a surge, a chance to strike back, because she'd tracked Trent's deals for weeks, knew his stash house on the edge of town, a crumbling brick shell off Route 19, and as the team geared up, Nia strapped on a vest, her hands steady despite the ache in her bones because this was her fight, her shot to bury him, and they rolled out. 3 SUVs cutting through the dark. Aisha left with a junior agent. Keep her safe. Nia's only command as she climbed in beside Carla, the mill fading behind them, her focus narrowing to the mission, because she'd won in court, lost her home, and now she'd take Trent's empire. But as they neared the warehouse, tires crunching over broken glass, her gut twisted, a prickle of unease she couldn't shake, and Carla murmured, "Derek's got the perimeter," nodding to Agent Derek. Holt, a lanky man with a buzz cut and a quiet smirk, his green eyes flicking to Nia as he checked his comms, and she nodded back, trusting Carla's crew, because she had to, had no choice. And they breached the warehouse, doors splintering under their boots, the air thick with dust and the sharp tang of chemicals, crates stacked high, plastic bags glinting under their flashlights, a jackpot of cocaine she'd dreamed of seizing, and Nia's pulse spiked. "This is it." Her voice a whisper as she snapped photos, her evidence piling up, because this could end him, could break his grip, and for a moment she tasted victory, her team moving like shadows, tagging crates, planting trackers. When the silence shattered, gunfire erupting from the dark muzzle, flashes blinding as bullets tore through the air, and Nia dove behind a crate, her vest thudding against wood, her Glock drawn as Carla shouted, "Ambush!" Her words drowned by screams. Because Trent's goons were here, waiting, their rifles spitting death, and Nia fired back, her shots precise, dropping one thug as blood sprayed the concrete. But the team was falling, an agent crumpling beside her, his chest a red ruin, another pinned by a hail of lead, and Nia's heart seized, her sting a slaughter because this wasn't random, wasn't luck, they'd been sold out. And as she crawled through the chaos, her elbows scraping raw, she saw Derek, not fighting, not ducking but slipping out a side door, his smirk gone, his comms silent, and realization hit like a fist. He's the mole. Her whisper lost in the gunfire, because Derek had tipped Trent, had fed him their plan, and now her team was dying. Carla pinned across the room, her leg bleeding, her shouts fading, and Nia lunged forward, her body screaming as a bullet grazed her arm, hot pain searing her flesh, but she grabbed the USB, clutched the evidence because she couldn't lose it, couldn't let this be for nothing, and she bolted, her boots pounding as she burst through a shattered window, glass cutting her hands, the night swallowing her as the warehouse burned behind. Trent's trap a bloodbath she'd barely escaped, her breath ragged as she stumbled into the trees, her arm dripping red, her mind reeling, because Derek's betrayal had gutted her, had turned her win into a massacre, and as she hid, crouched in the underbrush, her phone buzzed, Carla's voice faint. "Get to Aisha, they're moving." And Nia's blood froze because Trent wasn't stopping, wasn't satisfied with this, and she ran, her wound pulsing, her legs pumping through the dark because the mill wasn't safe, wasn't a haven. And as she reached it, her sedan screeching to a stop, she saw the junior agent slumped, throat slit, blood pooling on the concrete, and Aisha was gone, the chair empty. A note scrawled in black ink, "You're next." And Nia's scream tore the night, her knees hitting the ground, because Trent had her daughter, had used Derek to rip her apart, and she clutched the USB, her only weapon left, her arm throbbing, her soul shredded, because this wasn't just a sting gone wrong, it was a dagger in her back, a betrayal from within that left her team dead, her child stolen, and as she staggered to her feet, her vision blurring with tears and rage, she knew Trent's game had leveled up, his power deeper than she'd feared, because he had eyes inside the DOJ, had turned her allies into enemies, and now Aisha was his leverage, his prize. And Nia's escape was a hollow shell, her wound a badge of failure, because she'd thought she could trust Carla's crew, thought she could strike back, but Derek had flipped it all, had handed Trent the keys to her destruction, and as she climbed into the car, her blood smearing the seat, she drove, her mind a storm of grief and fury because she'd lost everything in that warehouse, her team, her safety. Her daughter, and Trent was laughing, his goons closing in because he'd played her, had waited for her to rise so he could smash her down, and now Aisha's school was locked down, his men hunting her kid, a nightmare. She'd never imagined, and Nia's grip tightened, her jaw clenching because she was wounded, alone. Betrayed but not broken, not yet, because she'd find Aisha, would claw through hell to get her back, and Trent would pay. Derek would. Pay? Every bastard who turned on her would face her wrath, because this wasn't the end. It was the spark, a fire he'd lit that she'd turn against him. Because Nia Jackson didn't bow, didn't break, she fought. And this war was hers to win, no matter the cost, no matter the blood, because Aisha was out there scared, waiting, and Nia would burn Harasses to the ground before she let Trent take her daughter's life. Her resolve a blade sharpened by loss, her next move a vow, carved in the dark. Nia Jackson slumped in the driver's seat, her sedan idling on a muddy back road outside Harasses, the Georgia night pressing in thick and heavy, her arm throbbing where a bullet had grazed her in the warehouse ambush, blood soaking her sleeve. As she gripped the USB, her last shred of evidence against Trent Baxter, her breath hitching as Aisha's empty chair at the mill flashed in her mind. The note, "You're next," a claw in her gut, because Trent had her daughter, had turned Agent Derek Holt's betrayal into a massacre that left her team dead. Her safe house a graveyard, and now she was alone, wounded, hunted. The hum of crickets a cruel lullaby as she fought the tears stinging her eyes. Her daughter's face, her terrified mommy from the burning safe house, fueling a rage that burned hotter than her pain, because she couldn't stop, couldn't break, not with Aisha out there. And she straightened, her jaw clenching as she plugged the USB into her burner phone, her fingers slick with sweat and blood as she hacked into Trent's personal line, her DOJ training kicking in, her screen flickering with code as she bypassed his security, her heart pounding when his voice crackled through a recorded call from hours ago. "Move the girl, tighten the net." His drawl cold, and she traced it. A signal pinging to a warehouse 30 miles north, her next target, because she'd lost everything. But she still had this, still had the power to hit him, and she uploaded it all, every file from the USB, Trent's drug deals, his payoffs, his orders to kill, blasting it to the feds, to news outlets, to anyone who'd listen. Her post a digital Molotov. "Trent Baxter's a crook, here's the proof," and she hit send. The internet erupting as likes surged. Shares spiked. "Arrest him now. Justice for Nia," the tide shifting, and within hours, sirens wailed across Harasses, feds swarming Trent's stash houses, cuffs snapping on his goons, arrest, warrants dropping like hail, and Nia watched it unfold on her phone parked in the shadows, her chest heaving with a grim triumph, because she'd done it, had cracked his empire, and as WHTV cut to breaking news, Officer Baxter detained, drug ring exposed. She thought it was over, thought she'd won, her evidence a blade in his heart, and she whispered to the dark, "Hold on, Aisha, I'm coming," because the feds would find her, would save her, but then her phone buzzed, Carla's name, flashing, her voice tight, "He's out, Sheriff sprung him." And Nia's blood ran cold because Trent wasn't fazed, wasn't finished. His smirk a ghost in her mind as she realized he'd bribed the sheriff, had flipped her victory into dust, and before she could process it, WHTV flipped again. Breaking update, warehouse deaths tied to Nia Jackson, and her face splashed. Across the screen, a mugshot from Trent's frame-up now labeled Cop Killer, the anchor's voice grim. Suspect in custody linked to ambush, 5 officers dead, and Nia's stomach lurched because Trent had turned the tables, had pinned the massacre Derek set up on her. His lie a masterpiece because the feds hadn't caught him, hadn't stopped him, and now she was the fugitive. Her triumph a trap, and she floored the gas, her sedan lurching forward as Aisha whimpered in her memory because she couldn't stay still, couldn't let him win. And as she drove, her phone lit up with alerts. Nationwide manhunt, armed and dangerous. Her name a curse on every channel, and she saw drones buzzing overhead, their red eyes slicing the night. Their hum a hunter's call as she swerved into the trees, branches scraping her car. Her breath shallow because Trent's power was a beast, his bribe a key that unlocked his cage, and he'd struck back, had made her the monster, and she pulled Aisha's jacket tighter around her shoulders, a ghost of her daughter's warmth because she was running now. A fugitive with no allies, no safe house, no team, and as she ditched the car, her boots sinking into mud, she heard choppers in the distance, their blades a heartbeat she couldn't escape because Trent had leveled up, had turned her evidence into his alibi. She planted it all, his voice on the news, calm and smug. She's the real threat, and Nia's fists clenched. Her wound pulsing as she crouched in the underbrush, because he'd bribed the sheriff, had spun the narrative, and now the feds were after her, not him. Her victory a mirage, and she checked her phone, battery dying, signal weak. But Carla's last text glowed. He's got pulled deeper than we thought. And Nia's mind raced, because Trent wasn't just a cop, he was a puppet master, his strings tied to men in high places, and as she moved, her arm bleeding through the makeshift bandage, she heard dogs barking, their howls closing in, because the manhunt was real, was his doing, and Aisha was still out there, still his prisoner. And Nia's resolve hardened, her pain a fuel because she'd exposed him, had landed a blow. But he'd countered, had made her the villain, and now she was on the run, her daughter's life. The stake, her freedom the cost. And as she slipped deeper into the woods, her boots silent on pine needles, she knew he'd keep pushing, keep twisting, because Trent didn't lose, didn't quit. And this was his checkmate, his power, monstrous. Now a machine she couldn't outpace, and she wondered who else he owned, how far his reach stretched, because the sheriff was just the start, just a pawn. And as drones swept overhead, their beams missing her by inches, she ducked under a fallen log, her breath a hiss, because she was bleeding, hunted, alone, but not broken, not yet. And Aisha's face kept her moving, kept her fighting, because Trent thought he'd won, thought he'd crushed her. But she'd claw back, would find a way, and as the choppers faded, their lights dimming, she checked the USB, still in her pocket. Her last card, because she'd played it, had struck, but he'd flipped the board and now she was the prey. Her victory a fleeting gasp before his storm, and she whispered to the night, "I'll get you back, baby." Her vow a thread in the dark, because Trent's empire was cracked but not down, and he'd keep coming. Keep escalating, because this was war and he'd made it personal. His bribe a slap, his frame up a noose, and Nia's fire burned, her next move forming, because she'd run now but she'd rise, would turn his game against him, because he'd taken her daughter, had turned the world against her, and she'd make him regret it. Her wound a badge, her fury a blade, because Nia Jackson didn't bow, she broke the unbreakable, and Trent Baxter was about to learn that, one bloody step at a time. Can a mother's love outmatch a monster's lies? Comment number 1 if you believe Nia's still got fight in her. Number 2 if you think Trent's too deep to beat. Like if this chase has your heart racing, and subscribe to see if she turns fugitive into avenger. So where does Nia strike next? Does she hide in the shadows, or does she rally a new army to take this beast down? Nia Jackson crouched in the damp underbrush, her breath fogging in the cool Georgia night, her arm throbbing where the bullet graze had crusted over, her boots caked with mud from fleeing the drones and dogs that hunted her. Trent Baxter's frame-up branding her a cop killer, now a nationwide siren screaming her name. Her sedan abandoned miles back, her only lifeline the USB clutched in her pocket. Its data her last weapon after she'd leaked his drug ring, thought she'd won, only for him to bribe the sheriff and flip her victory into this nightmare. Aisha's kidnapping a wound that bled deeper than her flesh, her daughter's absence, a void she filled with fury as she slipped through the woods, her DOJ training, guiding her to Atlanta, a city big enough to swallow her. Her burner phone buzzing with a single text from Carla. "Lay low, we're compromised." A warning she heeded as she ditched the device in a creek, its plunk a farewell to her old life. Because Trent's reach had claws in the DOJ. Derek's betrayal proof of that, and now she was a ghost. Her face plastered on every screen, her only hope the shadows. And as dawn broke, she stumbled into Atlanta's underbelly, a maze of graffiti-streaked alleys and flickering neon. Her jacket hood pulled tight as she knocked on a rusted door off Peachtree. Her knuckles raw and it creaked open, revealing Jamal Reese, a wiry black activist with dreads and a scar across his cheek, his dark eyes narrowing until recognition hit. "Nia, damn, you're a wanted woman." His voice low, and she nodded. "I need help," her plea a lifeline, because Jamal ran a network, ex-cops, hackers, street fighters who'd tangled with corruption before, and he pulled her in. The safe house a cluttered den of folding chairs and laptops, the air thick with coffee and defiance, and she briefed them, her voice steady despite the ache. "Trent." Baxter's a kingpin, framed me, took my daughter. Her words a spark that lit their eyes because they knew his kind, had fought his kind, and Jamal grinned, "We'll bury him," his crew nodding, a chorus of "Hell yeah," and Nia exhaled, her isolation cracking as she built an army. Her USB handed to a hacker named Tasha, her fingers flying as she spread Trent's dirt wider. "This goes viral," Tasha said. And it did, the movement swelling online. Justice for Nia trending, protests flaring in Harriston, Atlanta, beyond. And Nia rallied them, her voice a blade on stolen streams. "He's a liar, a dealer, here's the proof." Her evidence hitting stash houses as feds raided, Trent's empire crumbling under the weight of her war, and she dared to hope, dared to think she'd win, because the raids piled up, his goons arrested, his cash seized, and Jamal slapped her shoulder. "You're a legend," his grin wide, but Nia's eyes stayed hard. Not till Aisha's back. Her focus a laser, because this was step one. And as days blurred into nights, her army grew 50 strong. Their safe house a hive of plans, maps pinned to walls, and she felt it. The tide turning, her fugitive status a badge they wore proud, because they believed her, fought for her, and the feds hit Trent's last warehouse, a live feed showing crates hauled out. "Baxter's done," the anchor said, and Nia's chest swelled, her win within reach until the ground shook, a blast ripping through Atlanta's core, her safe house trembling as screams echoed outside, and she bolted to the window, her heart stopping as smoke billowed from downtown. Her rally she'd sparked, 50 of her own obliterated by a bomb. The TV cutting to chaos, bodies strewn across pavement, blood pooling under banners reading Nia's truth, and the anchor's voice trembled. "Terrorist attack, Nia Jackson. Linked." And Nia's knees buckled, her breath a gasp as Trent's face flashed on screen, his uniform crisp, his tone grave. "She's behind this. A radical." His lie a sledgehammer, because he'd bombed her people, had turned her fight into his weapon, and Jamal grabbed her arm. "We gotta move." His voice tight, but she couldn't, not yet. Her eyes locked on the carnage, 50 dead. Her allies, her hope, and Tasha's laptop pinged. A leaked report. Explosives traced to Jackson. A frame-up so slick it stole her air because Trent wasn't crumbling, wasn't cornered. He'd struck back, had planted this, and her army. Scattered, Jamal's crew peeling off. Too hot. Their whispers a betrayal she couldn't stop. And then the worst hit, a text from an unknown number. "Aisha says hi." With a photo, her daughter bound, gagged, tears streaking her face, and Nia's scream tore the room. Her fists slamming the table as Jamal pulled her back. "He's got her, he's got her." Her voice breaking, because Trent had snatched Aisha mid-chaos, had used the bomb to gut her resistance, and now he held her child, her world, and the safe house, emptied. Her 50 cut to 5, Jamal staying, Tasha trembling. "We're done." Her voice a whisper, but Nia shook her head. "No, he's not." Her fury a furnace because Trent's trap had snapped shut, had bombed her rally, pinned it on her, taken Aisha and left her alone, her movement shattered, her name a curse, and as sirens wailed, closing in, she grabbed her gun, her eyes burning. "We find her," her order a vow. Because he'd hit her hardest, had turned her army to ash, her daughter to bait, and she stumbled outside, the city a war zone, smoke choking the sky, because Trent's power wasn't broken, it was unleashed, his bomb a message, his smirk, a shadow she felt, and Jamal followed. "Where?" His voice urgent, and she pointed north. "The warehouse, he's there." Her gut screaming it because the photo's background matched, and she ran, her legs pumping, her wound splitting open, blood dripping as she moved, because Aisha was out there scared, waiting, and Trent had won this round, had crushed her uprising, but she wasn't done, wasn't dust. And as copters buzzed above, their lights hunting her, she ducked into an alley, her breath ragged, her resolve steel, because he'd taken her people, her child, her name, but not her fight, and she'd claw back would find him, because this wasn't surrender, it was reload. Her army gone, her daughter his prize, and Nia's war was personal now, a mother's wrath against a monster's game, because Trent thought he'd broken her, thought he'd won, but she'd rise from this rubble, would turn his trap into his tomb, And as she vanished into Atlanta's dark, her blood marking her path, she whispered, "I'm coming, baby." Her vow a thread in the chaos, because he'd bombed her world, had framed her again, and she'd make him bleed for it one way or another, because Nia Jackson didn't bow, she burned. And Trent Baxter was fuel, his victory a spark she'd turned to flame, her next move a desperate gamble, her daughter's life the stake, because he'd escalated, had made it a slaughter, and she'd match him blow for blow until one of them was ash. Nia Jackson sprinted through Atlanta's shadowed alleys, her boots pounding wet pavement, her arm pulsing with fresh blood as the grays from the warehouse ambush split wider, her lungs burning as she clutched 2 stolen Glocks, their cold steel, a lifeline in the chaos. The city's air thick with smoke from Trent Baxter's bomb that had gutted her rally, 50 of her allies dead, his frame-up pinning her as a terrorist, now a noose tightening with every siren wailing in the distance, her safe house a memory, her army shattered, and Aisha, her 8-year-old daughter, his captive, the photo of her, bound and gagged a knife. In Nia's chest, "Aisha says hi," the text had mocked, and she'd traced it. The blurry background matching a rural compound 30 miles north, her target now as she ran, Jamal Reese and Tasha flanking her, their breaths ragged, their loyalty a thin thread after the blast scattered her crew, because Trent had bombed her fight, had taken her child. And Nia's fury was a furnace, her DOJ training a map, as she hot-wired a pickup off a side street, its engine growling to life. "Get in!" her voice a whip, and they piled into the cab. Her foot slamming the gas as they tore out of the city, headlights slicing the dark. Her mind locked on Aisha, because she'd lost too much. Her team in the warehouse, her safe house to the mob, her name to his lies. But not her daughter, not yet. And Jamal gripped a shotgun. "He's got muscle there," his warning sharp, and Tasha hacked a satellite feed on her laptop. 10 guards, armed heavy, her voice trembling. But Nia's eyes stayed hard. "I don't care." Her resolve a blade, because this was her shot, her only shot. And as they hit the countryside, pines looming like sentinels, she spotted the compound, a squat concrete bunker ringed by barbed wire, floodlights glaring, and she killed the engine a half-mile out. "We go quiet," her whisper a command, and they slipped through the trees, her Glock steady as she led, her wound dripping red, her pain a fuel because Aisha was in there, scared, waiting. And Nia moved like a ghost, Jamal and Tasha trailing, their steps muffled as they reached the fence, her wire cutters snipping a gap, and they crawled through. The guards chatter a distant hum as she clocked their patrols. 10 men, rifles slung, Trent's lieutenant a hulking figure barking orders near a side door, and Nia's plan snapped into place. Jamal flanked left, Tasha rig a distraction, her orders crisp, and Tasha rigged a gas can from the pickup, her hands shaking as she lit a rag, tossing it toward a shed, the explosion blooming orange. Guards shouting as they ran, and Nia struck, her Glocks blazing as she dropped 2 men, their bodies crumpling. Blood pooling on gravel, Jamal's shotgun roaring as he took another, and she bolted for the door, her shoulder slamming it open. The bunker's halls dim and dank, her boots echoing as she moved, her ears straining for Aisha's voice, and she found her. A locked room at the end, her daughter's muffled sobs seeping through. "Mommy!" A cry that broke her. And Nia kicked the door, wood splintering as she burst in, Aisha bound to a chair, her small face streaked with tears, and Nia cut her free, her knife flashing. "I've got you!" her voice cracking as she pulled her close, Aisha's arms clinging. "I knew you'd come." And Nia's heart swelled, her hero moment a lifeline because she'd saved her, had beaten Trent's trap, and she scooped Aisha up, her Glocks ready as Jamal shouted, "Move!" his shotgun blasting a guard who'd followed. And they ran, Tasha waving from the fence. "Truck's hot," her voice urgent, and they piled in, tires screeching as Nia floored it, sirens wailing behind because they'd done it, had stormed his lair, freed Aisha, and she hugged her daughter. Tight. "You're safe." Her promise a balm, but as they hit the highway her phone buzzed, a live stream popping up, Trent's face filling the screen, his uniform pristine, his drawl chilling. "She's a rogue agent, attacked us," and Nia's gut twisted because it wasn't him. It was Carla, Agent Carla Ruiz, her face bruised, her voice broken. "Nia's gone off book, she's dangerous." A forced confession aired to millions, and Nia's breath stopped because Trent had her, had beaten Carla into this lie, and the DOJ's voice cut in. "We disown Nia Jackson. Effective now." A hammer blow as Marshall's choppers roared overhead, their lights pinning her truck. And Aisha whimpered, "Mummy, what's happening?" And Nia's jaw clenched. He's fighting dirty, because her rescue was Pyrrhic, her win tainted. Trent's masterstroke a broadcast that turned her savior moment into exile. And she swerved off-road, branches snapping as Marshals closed in, her Glocks useless now. Because he'd killed his lieutenant, had framed her escape as an attack. And Carla's words were his dagger, the DOJ her shield no more, and Jamal cursed, "He's everywhere," his shotgun dropping, Tasha's laptop dead, and Nia drove. Her eyes burning, because she'd saved Aisha, had held her, but Trent had flipped it, had made her a pariah, and as choppers descended, their beams blinding, she knew he'd planned this, had waited for her to rise so he could crush her. His power a web she couldn't break because he'd lost Aisha, but gained the world, his lie a tidal wave, and Nia's triumph was hollow, her daughter safe, but her life a ruin because Marshals shouted through megaphones, "Surrender, Jackson." Their guns trained, and she stopped, her hands up, Aisha sobbing beside her, because Trent's endgame was here, his smirk a shadow she felt, and she'd fought, had won her child, but lost everything else, her rescue a spark he'd snuffed, because he wasn't just a cop, he was a plague, and she was his prey, her victory, a gasp before his storm, and as cuffs snapped on her wound screaming, she held Aisha's gaze, "I love you." Her whisper a vow because he'd taken her freedom, her name, but not her fight, and she'd rise again, would make him pay. Because Nia Jackson didn't bow, she burned, and Trent Baxter was fuel. His win a spark she'd turn to flame. Does a mother's win outweigh a monster's lie? Comment number 1 if you think Nia's rescue proves she's unbreakable. Number 2, if Trent's got her cornered for good, like if this twist has you reeling, and subscribe to see if she fights. From the ashes. So what's Trent's next play? Does he savor this checkmate, or does he twist the knife deeper with a new horror? Nia Jackson sat rigid in the pickup's cab, her hands raised, her Glocks useless on the seat beside her, as chopper blades thumped overhead, their blinding beams pinning her in the Georgia woods, Aisha trembling in her lap, her small arms clinging. Tight. "Mommy, don't leave." Her voice a splinter in Nia's heart, the Marshals' megaphones barking. "Nia Jackson, exit the vehicle, you're under arrest." Their rifles glinting through the trees, because Trent Baxter had flipped her rescue, had aired Agent Carla Ruiz's forced confession calling her a rogue, the DOJ disowning her in a heartbeat, her triumph snatching Aisha from his compound, now a crime, her arm bleeding through the makeshift bandage, her wound a pulsing ache as she whispered, "Stay strong, baby," and kissed Aisha's forehead because she'd saved her daughter, had stormed his lair, but Trent's lie had turned it sour, and Jamal Reese and Tasha slumped beside her, their weapons down, their fight drained as Marshals swarmed, boots crunching gravel, cuffs snapping on Nia's wrists, the steel cold against her skin, and she didn't resist, didn't flinch, her eyes locked on Aisha as they pulled her away, her daughter's sobs echoing, "Mommy." A sound that carved her soul, because this was her play, her false surrender. Her DOJ training kicking in as she slipped the USB, her evidence against Trent into a Marshal's pocket, her move silent, slick, because she'd leaked it once, had cracked his empire, and now she'd let the feds finish it. And they hauled her into a van, Aisha handed to a social worker, her screams fading as the door slammed, and Nia sat, her head high, her mind racing, because she'd lost her freedom, her team, her name, but not her fight. And as the van rolled, tires humming on asphalt, she heard radios crackle. Baxter's in custody, drug ledger found, and her lips twitched, a ghost of a smile because it worked. Her USB had landed. Trent's arrest a hammer blow she'd swung from the shadows, and hours later, WHTV blared it. "Officer Trent Baxter detained. Evidence ties him to drug ring." The anchor's voice tight, and Nia, locked in a cell, her orange jumpsuit stiff, felt it, the tide turning because she was cleared, the Marshals' faces softening as a captain entered. "Charges dropped. You're free." His tone clipped, and cheers erupted outside, protesters chanting her name, Naya's truth, Ame. Wave she'd sparked, and they uncuffed her. Her wrists raw, her heart pounding as Aisha ran in, Mommy! Her hug a lifeline, and Nia held her, her victory real, tangible, because Trent was down, his empire gutted, and she walked out. The courthouse steps alive with supporters, their signs high, justice won. And she breathed, her daughter's hand in hers, thinking it was over, thinking she'd won, but as night fell, the air shifted. A tremor she felt before she heard it. A blast rocking the precinct 2 blocks away, glass shattering, smoke billowing as screams pierced the quiet. And Nia's gut dropped, her phone buzzing with a live stream. Trent's face filling the screen, his uniform gone, his smirk wide. She thought she'd stop me, his voice a growl, because he wasn't in custody, wasn't broken. His cartel, allies had sprung him, had bombed the station, and Nia's knees weakened. Aisha clutching her. What's that? Her voice small, and Nia's eyes widened as the feed cut to her. Dragged from the cell, her jumpsuit torn, her face bruised, Trent's fist slamming her jaw, uppity trash, his slur a whip, and Aisha screamed, Mommy! Because it was live, global, his torture a spectacle, his goons pinning her as he kicked her ribs. Blood pooling on concrete, and Nia's breath stopped. Because this wasn't a replay, wasn't a trick, it was now. Trent's escape a dagger, his cartel a beast she hadn't caged, and he'd taken her again, had snatched her from custody. Because her surrender was a feint, had worked. But he'd countered, had turned her win into this. And Aisha sobbed, They've got you. Her tiny hands shaking, and Nia pulled her close. No, baby, I'm here. Her voice steady because she was free, was with her. But the stream was real, her torture unfolding as Jamal burst in. They hit the transport, took you. His words a punch, and Nia's mind spun because it wasn't her, couldn't be. But it looked like her, a double, a stand-in, Trent's ploy to break her, to show the world he'd won. And she ran outside, the precinct's wreckage glowing orange, bodies strewn, her victory a lie. Because he'd bombed it, had faked her capture, was torturing someone else to crush her spirit. And Aisha watched, her eyes wide, the stream looping. You're next. Trent's voice a vow, and Nia's fists clenched, her wound screaming, as she realized he'd escalated, had turned her surrender into his stage because he wasn't just free, he was unstoppable, his cartel a hydra, his smirk a promise. And she'd cleared her name, had held Aisha, but he'd ripped it away, had made her a ghost again because the feds swarmed. Where is she? Their shouts frantic, and Jamal pulled her back. It's a setup. His voice urgent, but Nia shook, her daughter's tears. Soaking her shirt, because Trent had her double, was beating her live, and the world thought it was her. Thought she'd lost, and as choppers buzzed, their lights hunting, she knew he'd planned this, had waited for her to rise, to free herself, so he could smash her down. His power a storm she couldn't outrun because he'd lost the precinct, lost his badge, but gained this, a global knife in her gut, and Aisha whispered, Make him stop, her plea a weight, and Nia's resolve. Hardened, her pain a fuel because he'd taken her again, had twisted her win into torture, and she'd saved Aisha, had struck him, but he'd struck back, his cartel a beast she hadn't slain, and as the stream looped, her doubles screams, a chorus she knew he'd keep coming, keep escalating, because Trent didn't lose, didn't quit, and this was his endgame, his victory, a spotlight on her ruin, and she stood, her legs trembling, her eyes burning, because she was free, was with Aisha, but not safe, not whole. And he'd made it. Personal, had turned her daughter's eyes to this horror, and Nia's fire blazed, her next move forming because he'd bombed her world, had faked her fall. And she'd rise, would find him because this wasn't surrender, it was war, and he'd taken her peace, her name, her breath, but not her fight. And as the precinct burned, its smoke a shroud, she held Aisha tight, her whisper a vow. He'll pay because Trent Baxter was fuel, his win a spark she'd turn to flame. Her daughter's sobs a call she'd answer, because Nia Jackson didn't bow, she broke the unbreakable, and he'd learn that one bloody step at a time. Nia Jackson stood frozen on the courthouse steps, her arms wrapped tight around Aisha, her daughter's sobs soaking her shirt as the night sky glowed orange from the precinct's wreckage 2 blocks away. The bomb Trent Baxter's cartel had detonated, still ringing in her ears. Its smoke a bitter shroud as sirens wailed. Her victory of clearing her name, of holding Aisha after the rescue, now a fragile shell because Trent had flipped it, had sprung from custody. His live stream of a double's torture, uppity trash, his slur echoing globally, a knife in her gut. Aisha's, "Make him stop," a plea she couldn't answer, her arm throbbing where the greys wept blood. Her orange jumpsuit swapped for a borrowed jacket, her freedom a gasp as feds swarmed the chaos. Where is she? Their shouts lost in the roar, because they thought she was the one beaten, thought Trent had her, and Jamal Reese yanked her. "Faber, we've got to move." His voice sharp, Tasha trembling beside him, her laptop dead. But Nia's legs locked, her eyes on the stream looping on a bystander's phone, the double's screams, her face a mirror, Trent's fist a blur. And she shook, her daughter's tears a weight because he'd turned her win into this, had bombed the precinct, had faked her fall, and as choppers buzzed overhead, their beams hunting, she knew he'd keep coming. His cartel a beast she couldn't outrun. But then a hand gripped her shoulder, firm, steady. Marcus Tate, her lawyer, his wiry frame cutting through the crowd, his brown eyes fierce. "Nia now." His voice a lifeline, and she blinked. "Marcus." Her whisper raw because he'd fought for her in court, had cracked Trent's lies, and now he was here, his car idling at the curb. "Get in." His order crisp, and she obeyed, piling Aisha into the back seat. Jamal and Tasha following as Marcus floored it, tires screeching through Harriston's chaos, the precinct's flames fading behind, and Nia's breath hitched. "How'd you know?" Her question a rasp, and Marcus grinned. Grim. "Been tracking. You since the verdict. Knew he'd pull something." His hands steady on the wheel because he'd hacked the stream. Had seen Trent's move, and now he was her shadow, her hidden ally. "Feds are blind, I'm not." His voice a vow, and he swerved into a back alley, his sedan cloaked in dark as he briefed her. "He's got cartel ties, deep ones, I've got proof." His laptop glowing with files, bank records, calls, Trent's web unspooling, and Nia's pulse spiked. Enough to end him, her hope flickering, because Marcus had dug where she couldn't, had found the threads, and he nodded. Enough to bury him, his plan snapping into place. "We hit the FBI, rogue unit. They'll move." And Nia clutched Aisha, her daughter's shivers easing, because this was her shot, her lifeline. And Marcus drove, his safe house a squat brick hideout on the edge of town, its walls thick, its windows barred, and they piled in. Nia's boots thudding on concrete as Marcus hacked the stream again, his fingers flying. Going live, his voice tight, and he patched the cartel proof to every feed, Trent's voice snarling over cash drops. "Clean it up," his empire exposed, and Nia watched, her chest heaving as likes surged, shares spiked. "Take him down," the internet roaring, and within minutes, tires screeched outside. A rogue FBI unit, black SUVs, agents in vests storming in. "We've got your back," their leader gruff, and Nia exhaled. "Get him." Her order a blade, because Marcus had flipped the script, had turned Trent's stage into hers, and the agents moved, choppers lifting off. Their target the compound where the stream pulsed, and Nia stood, Aisha beside her. Her daughter's hand in hers as the feed cut to static, then gunfire, shouts, and Trent's face, wild, bloodied, his knee buckling as Nia's shot, her Glock from the rescue, replayed in her mind. Because the FBI breached, dragged him out. His leg limp, his smirk gone, and she'd crippled him, had struck. Her allies move a checkmate, and the agents radioed. "Baxter's down." Their voices crackling, and Nia's knees weakened, her victory real, tangible, because he was caught, was hers, and Aisha hugged her. "You did it," her whisper a balm, but as the feed cleared, the ground shook, a blast ripping through Harriston's black district. 10 blocks square, homes collapsing, flames licking the sky, and Nia's breath stopped, the TV cutting to chaos. Mass explosion, hundreds feared dead. The anchor's voice trembling, and Trent's laugh crackled through, his cell feed. "Liv, you thought you'd win." His voice a taunt because he'd planted it, had rigged it, his final blow as cuffs snapped on him, and Nia's scream tore the room. No! Her fists slamming the wall because he'd bombed her people, her community, had turned her strike into slaughter, and the anchor said it. Nia Jackson blamed terrorist ties. His lie a sledgehammer, because he'd framed her again, had made her the monster. And Marcus cursed, "He's untouchable," his laptop crashing, Tasha sobbing hundreds, her voice breaking, and Aisha clung. "Mommy, why?" Her question a dagger, because Nia's win was ash. Her shot at Trent a spark he'd turned to genocide, and the FBI agents froze, their radios buzzing. "Jackson's the target." Their eyes shifting, because he'd planned this, had waited for her to rise, to cripple him, so he could crush her. His cartel a ghost, his bomb a legacy, and Nia staggered, her wound bleeding through, her vision blurring as the safe house shook, choppers circling, because he'd lost his freedom, his leg, but won this. Had gutted her world, and she held Aisha, her daughter's tears a flood because hundreds were dead, her name their curse. And Trent cackled, his cell a throne because he wasn't down, wasn't dust. He'd escalated, had made her the villain, and as the agents turned, "We've got orders," their voices cold. Nia knew he'd flipped it, had turned her allies. Move into his triumph, because the blast wasn't random, was his. And she'd shot his knee, had caught him but lost everything, her community a graveyard, her fight a trap, and Marcus grabbed her. "We run," his voice urgent, but she shook, her eyes on the flames, because Trent's power was a hydra. His laugh a promise, and she'd won the battle, had held Aisha, but he'd won the war, had bombed her soul, and as the safe house trembled, feds closing in, she clutched her daughter. "I'm sorry." Her whisper a weight, because he'd taken her people, her hope, her breath, and she'd crippled him, had struck, but he'd struck back, his bomb a noose, his frame up a chain, and Nia's fire flickered, her next move a gasp, because he'd made it personal, had turned her victory into ruin. Then she'd rise, would fight, but now she was alone. Her allies win a spark he'd snuffed, because Trent Baxter wasn't just a cop, he was a plague, and she was his prey, her resolve a thread in the dark, because he'd bombed Harasses. Hart had framed her again, and she'd make him pay, one bloody step at a time. Nia Jackson stumbled through Marcus Tate's safe house, her boots smearing blood from her reopened wound across the concrete floor, her arm a throbbing mess as she clutched Aisha tight, her daughter's tear-streaked face buried in her chest, the walls trembling from choppers circling overhead, their beams slicing through barred windows as the echo of Trent Baxter's bomb still rattled her bones. Harriston's Black District a smouldering grave, hundreds dead, his voice cackling from his cell on the live feed. "You thought you'd win." A taunt that turned her victory to ash, because Marcus had hacked the stream, had exposed Trent's cartel ties, had crippled his knee with her shot, but Trent's final blow had flipped it, his planted explosive framing her as the terrorist, WHTV blaring. Nia Jackson blamed, hundreds feared dead. The anchor's voice a nail in her coffin, and Marcus grabbed her shoulder. "We've got to move," that's his wiry frame tense, his brown eyes darting as feds pounded the door. "FBI, open up." Their shouts a noose, because Trent's lie had turned her allies' win into her ruin, and Tasha sobbed, "It's over." Her laptop dead, but Nia shook her head. Not yet. Her voice steel, because she'd saved Aisha, had struck Trent. And she wouldn't let him bury her, not like this. And she bolted to Marcus's desk, her hands shaking as she grabbed his burner phone, her DOJ training a lifeline as she hacked the precinct's feed, her fingers flying, because she'd recorded Trent's confession weeks ago, his growled "clean it up" from the USB, her ace stashed safe, and she found it, a file buried in her cloud, his voice clear. "Blow the district. Pin it on her." A smoking gun he didn't know she'd kept. And she uploaded it, her breath ragged as she patched it to every outlet, every stream. "This is Nia Jackson. Trent Baxter bombed Harrison. Here's the proof." Her words a flare in the dark, and she hit send, the internet igniting, shares surging. "She's innocent. Arrest him." The tide shifting as the safe house door splintered, feds breaching, their vests glinting. But Marcus stalled them. "Wait, look." His laptop thrust forward, the confession looping. Trent's smug drawl a death knell, and the agents froze, their radios buzzing. "Stand down, verify," their leader gruff, and Nia held Aisha, her daughter's mommy, a whisper, as the nation reeled. WHTV cutting in. "New evidence clears. Jackson implicates Baxter." The anchor's voice tight and the feds backed off. "You're clear." Their retreater gasped because she'd done it, had flipped his frame up, her name a beacon again. And DOJ brass called, "You're reinstated, lead investigator." Their tone clipped, and Nia stood, her legs trembling. Aisha's arms around her, because she was a hero, had clawed back. And Harasses rallied, protests swelling. Nia's truth, their chance a shield. But as night fell, her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Check the news," and her gut twisted, WHTV flashing. "Baxter's Dying Act alias." Leaked, her undercover name, Shadowhawk, scrolling across the screen. A gift to every cartel in America. And Nia's breath stopped, because he'd done it, had turned his loss into her doom, his last breath a dagger. And as she spun, tires screeched outside. A black van unloading 5 men, masks tight, guns drawn, their steps silent as they fanned out. Assassins Trent had summoned, and Nia shoved Aisha behind her. "Get down!" Her voice a whip as she grabbed Marcus's Glock, her wound screaming, because they were here, were now, and the first shot shattered the window, glass raining as Jamal fired back, his shotgun roaring, dropping one, but they kept coming. Their bullets tearing plaster, and Nia moved, her training a dance as she rolled, her Glock barking, 2 down, blood spraying the walls, and Tasha screamed, "They're everywhere," her hands fumbling a knife. But Nia stayed calm, her shots precise, a third crumpling, his mask slipping, to reveal a cartel tattoo, and she knew Trent's last play, her whisper grim, because he'd leaked her alias, had sicked them on her, and as the fourth lunged, his blade glinting, she ducked, her elbow cracking his jaw, her Glock finishing him, and the fifth bolted, tires squealing as he fled. But Nia stood, her chest heaving, Aisha sobbing, "Mommy," and she pulled her close. "It's okay." Her lie a shield because it wasn't, not anymore. The rooftop clash a taste of the war Trent had unleashed, his dying act a bounty on her head, and Marcus checked the bodies. "Los Zetas, he sold you out," his voice tight, and Nia's jaw clenched because she'd cleared her name, had won the fight but lost her peace, her life now a hunted wreck, and as feds swarmed back, "We'll protect you," their promise hollow. She knew they couldn't. Knew Trent's leak was a death sentence, every cartel gunning for Shadowhawk, and Aisha's "why us" broke her. "Because I fought." Her answer raw, because she'd saved Harasses. Had buried Trent, but he'd buried her too. His confession her lifeline, his leak her noose, and she stood, her wound bleeding through, her Glock warm. Because the fight was won, the precinct cleared, the nation hers. But the cost was staggering, her daughter's eyes wide with fear, her future a gauntlet, and Marcus grabbed her. "We relocate now," his voice urgent, but Nia shook, her resolve steel, because she'd killed them, had stood her ground, but more would come, would hunt. And as choppers buzzed, their lights a cage, she held Aisha. "We'll be okay." Her vow a thread, because Trent was dust, his empire ash, but his legacy was this, a war she couldn't outrun, and she'd saved her child, had cleared her name but lost her life, her alias a beacon to killers. And as the feds swept in, their vests glinting, she knew he'd planned this, had waited for her to rise, to win so he could doom her. His dying act a checkmate, and Nia's fire burned, her next move a gasp, because she'd fought, had won, but now she was prey, her daughter's safety a stake. And as the safe house stilled, bodies strewn, she whispered, "I'll protect you." Her promise a weight because Trent Baxter was gone. His win a spark she'd snuffed, but his shadow lingered, a plague she'd face, because Nia Jackson didn't bow, she broke the unbreakable, and this war was hers, one bloody step at a time. Nia Jackson stood amidst the carnage of Marcus Tate's safe house, her boots crunching glass and blood-soaked plaster, her arm a throbbing mess as she clutched Aisha tight, her daughter's small frame trembling against her, the air thick with gunpowder and the tang of death. 5 cartel assassins sprawled across the floor, their masks twisted, their guns silent. Trent Baxter's dying act, leaking her undercover alias Shadowhawk. A bounty that had brought them here, her Glock still warm in her hand, her breath ragged as feds swarmed in, their vests glinting under flickering lights. "We'll secure the area," their leader gruff, and Marcus wiped sweat from his brow. That was too close, his voice shaky. Tasha clutching her knife, her eyes wide, because Nia had cleared her name, had broadcast Trent's confession, blow the district, pin it on her, turning his bomb into her victory. The DOJ reinstating her as lead investigator, Haraston rallying behind her, Nia's truth a chant that echoed through the streets. And now she'd fought off his killers, had protected Aisha, her last stand a testament to her fire, and as dawn broke the feds escorted her out, choppers lifting off, their blades a fading hum, her sedan waiting, Aisha's hand in hers, because she'd won, had buried Trent, his empire ash, his knee crippled by her shot, his cellar tomb, and the DOJ called, "Task Force Head, you're up," their tone firm, a promotion she'd earned, and she drove, her wound bandaged by a medic, her daughters, "You're a hero." A bomb because Haraston rebuilt brick by brick, protest swelling. Justice served, their signs high, and Nia exhaled, her chest loosening as they reached Atlanta. A new safe house, its walls clean, its windows wide, Aisha's smile flickering. "Can we stay?" Her question soft, and Nia nodded. "For now." Her voice steady, because she was unbreakable, had risen from his ruins and days blurred into weeks, her task force forming, a team of 10 sharp and loyal, their office a hive of maps and files, Trent's cartel ties unspooling, arrests piling up, Los Zetas crumbling under her raids, and she stood tall, her blazer crisp, her hazel eyes fierce, because she'd turned his leak into her strength, had made Shadowhawk a legend, and Thaisha thrived, her school a haven, her laughter a light, and Nia dared to breathe, dared to think the war was won. Her victory a crown she wore because Haraston healed, its black district rising, her name a shield, and the DOJ brass visited. "You've changed the game." Their praise a weight, and she smiled, faint. Just starting. Her vow a thread. Because she'd fought, had bled, had won, and as night fell, her office quiet. Aisha asleep in the next room, Nia sat, her laptop glowing, her coffee cold, her mind drifting to the cost, the bomb, the bodies, the assassins, and she opened a secure file, her routine check when a new email pinged, encrypted, no sender, her gut twisting as she clicked, her screen filling with text. "You were our pawn," and her breath caught because it wasn't Trent, wasn't his voice, but a list, names, dates, ops, her ops, every move she'd made in Haraston, every sting, every leak, and a video, grainy. DOJ brass in a dark room. "Let her run! She'll expose Baxter, bury our tracks." Their voices calm, and Nia's heart stopped, because it was them, her bosses, the top, orchestrating her mission, sacrificing her to clean their slate, and a photo loaded, Trent shaking hands with a suit, a face she knew, Deputy Director Vance, her handler, and her knees buckled, her coffee crashing to the floor, because they'd played her, had set her up, had known Trent's rot, had used her to scrub it, and the bomb, the leak, her alias all calculated, her victories their shield, and Aisha's mommy from the doorway snapped her back. "What's wrong?" Her daughter's eyes wide, and Nia forced a smile. "Nothing, baby." Her lie a wall because it was everything, her triumph a lie, her DOJ a snake, and she burned the file, her lighter trembling as flames ate the drive. Her evidence gone, her proof dust because they'd won had turned her into their tool, and she stood, her jaw tight, her hazel eyes glinting, because Trent was dead, his cartel broken. But the real beast was above, watching, waiting, and she smiled, grim, her mind spinning because she'd risen, had led, had saved. But now she knew the war wasn't over, knew the DOJ's top brass had dangled her, had bombed Haraston to hide their sins, and Aisha hugged her. "You're the best," her trust await, and Nia's resolve hardened, her next move forming because she'd plot, would climb, would turn their game against them, and as the safe house stilled, the city humming beyond, she whispered, "Not done." Her vow a spark, because they'd used her, had sacrificed her, and she'd make them pay. Her task force a tool, her legend a blade, because Nia Jackson didn't bow, didn't break. She burned. And the DOJ was fuel. Their betrayal a fire she'd wield, her victory a mask she'd shed. Because the fight was hers, a new war, silent, deep, and she'd win, one bloody step at a time. Her daughter's safety, her stake, her justice, her own, because Trent was the pawn, and she'd been the queen. But now she saw the kings, and they'd fold her smile a promise, her heart a storm, because this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. A twist she'd turn to triumph, her way, her rules, her reckoning. Nia Jackson's relentless battle in racist cop accuses black woman in court moments later. The DOJ declares her their lead investigator. Unveils profound truths about resilience, betrayal, and justice. Her journey teaches us that courage isn't just facing external foes, but enduring when the ground beneath you shifts. Nia's fight against Trent Baxter, a corrupt cop steeped in racism, shows that standing up to systemic evil demands unshakable grit, even when it costs everything: home, safety, even innocence in the public eye. Her ability to pivot, to turn evidence into weapons despite overwhelming odds, highlights the power of intellect and strategy over brute force. Yet, the deepest lesson lies in the twist. Trust can be a double-edged sword. The DOJ's betrayal, using her as a pawn to mask their own corruption, reveals that heroes can be forged in fires lit by those they serve. Nia's refusal to break, even when her victory morphed into a new war, underscores that true strength is choosing to rise again, not just for oneself, but for those silenced by the same systems, like Aisha and Haraston's lost souls. It's a call to question power, to peel back facades because justice isn't handed over. It's wrested from the jaws of deceit. Her story urges us to fight smarter, to guard our trust, and to never let the flame of purpose flicker out no matter who fans the storm against us. So, what's your take? Can one woman's fire topple a corrupt empire? Or does betrayal always leave scars too deep to heal? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button if Nia's battle stirred you, subscribe for more tales of defiance, and share this with anyone who believes justice is worth the fight. Thanks for joining this wild ride. Here's to uncovering truth and standing tall against the odds wherever your own battles lead.